Good morning to everyone. Thanks for coming so early to this tutorial. We have a lot of material to cover, so I will go immediately with this. This is the tutorial in algorithmic bias, and the tutorial authors are Sarah Hayyan, Francesco Bonchi, and myself. I'm Carlos Castillo. Sarah Hayyan is the mastermind behind this tutorial. She is a young researcher, very talented. She works in this topic, privacy and non-discrimination. She was discriminated in a sense, so she's Iranian and her visa was delayed enormously and she couldn't make it here because of that. But she's a great researcher and it's a pleasure to work with her. Francesco Bonchi, the second author of the tutorial, he comes to this topic from his vast experience on privacy. And myself, Carlos Castillo, work in digital humanities and humanitarian computing, and that's my main reason that I got interested into this topic. We're going to have 4 parts, parts 1 and 2 before the break at around 10, and they're going to be about setting the stage and speaking about discrimination discovery, like how do we claim that someone or somebody or some group is being discriminated. And then the second part will be after the break, and it will be about mitigating and reducing this discrimination. And of course, we will have some time for discussion and further questions closer to the end of the talk. Unfortunately, we have a lot of material, so unless there is a very pressing question about like something that you don't understand at all in some slide, I will ask you to push them more to the end or to some pauses in the middle of the talk. I'm going to go ahead and start immediately with the introduction and the context for this problem. And let me tell you what's something that is really dangerous about creating algorithms and discrimination. So to discriminate is a very simple has a very simple definition: is to treat someone differently. And of course, we all can discriminate each other. If I have a job and there are 2 people applying, maybe I'm going to discriminate it by how much skills or experience they show for the job. And that's fine, but there is also unfair discrimination, which is based on which group do you belong and not in your individual merit, and which is what we are trying to fight here. Now, there is this very dangerous reasoning that given that people use these subjective and objective elements in their decisions, only people can discriminate. And given that machines use only objective data that you can quantify and codify and express in a very, let's say, deterministic, concrete way, then machines cannot discriminate, but actually they can discriminate, and they do. So let me give you an example. In the US, there is this COMPAS score. COMPAS is a program that is a score that is computed by a company called NorthPoint Inc. And it's a questionnaire having 137 questions that is applied to people when they are going to jail. And they take these answers to these 137 questions, and they created a predictive model of what is the chance that in the next 5 years you're going to commit a new crime, and what is the chance that in the next 5 years you're going to commit a violent crime. And these models are actually used by both defendants and prosecutors to either say to the judge that their client is a very dangerous person, or sorry, it's a very non-dangerous person, or by the prosecution to say that this client is a very dangerous, this defendant is a very dangerous person. Actually, if you analyze this data of the COMPAS score, you notice that their accuracy in the prediction task of whether this person is going to commit a crime in the next 5 years is about the same for blacks and whites, about 60%, but the errors are very different. So this algorithm tends to be too harsh with people that are black and too lenient with people that are white. So the errors have a different sign in both races. So for instance, if you look at the people that are of a black race that in the next 5 years did not commit any other crime, then you see that you come back to the algorithm score and you see a higher score than what you should. And while for white people in the same situation, this doesn't happen, and the opposite is true for whites. So this has been, of course, a matter of controversy, and this arrived even to the Supreme Court of the state of Wisconsin, which last month ruled that it's okay for judges to use these compass scores under certain conditions. So it's not unconditionally fine. There are some requirements. And the requirements are that the judge must see some big disclaimers about the fact that these scores are not transparent. They are computed in a way that you cannot tell because they are a proprietary secret of North Point Incorporated. They also have to tell the judges that some researchers have said that these scores are disproportionately affecting black people more than whites. And they can use, but the judges are allowed to use them as a factor to give an alternative to prison or as a factor to involve more stringent conditions on parole for the people who get parole. Something important, the judges are not allowed to use them to make the sentences longer or shorter. So in this case, the Supreme Court of Wisconsin is recognizing that this score, which is computed automatically, has certain merits, but it also has certain defects, certain drawbacks. Okay? Now, there are, the problem with algorithmic discrimination is that there are self-perpetuating algorithmic biases. And these you may know from your experience or from your, or even from your political views with respect to certain topics. But even think of a very simple example. Think that you have a person, Joe, and he goes to the bank to get a credit, and he gets a bad algorithmic score from the credit because of his race or because the way his nationality, his ethnicity, whatever unfair reason. I'm going to define that later. And so he has to take a credit at the biggest interest rate, and then the payments are larger. And then the risk of defaulting is bigger because he has to pay more. And then his credit score will be in the long term, like will be reduced, and you can actually go to the algorithm that discriminates and say, yeah, the algorithm was correct, but maybe the algorithm is affecting the system in a way that it's making things worse and worse in the long term for the minorities. The same happens with policies that affect disproportionately one group versus the other with respect to, for instance, the police stopping and searching you. Of course, the police stops and searches a certain group of people more. They will discover more, all other things equal, they may discover more reasons to have done that stop in the first place. To make things even worse, there is this thing about algorithmic opacity. So there is this very interesting book by Frank Pasquale called The Black Box Society. And he speaks about the fact that the algorithms tend to be opaque because of reasons such as industrial secrecy. In the case of North Point, that's the case. Or because there are legal protections, like intellectual property law that goes too far in protecting something in a sense that it shouldn't be. And there is also intentional obfuscation, so algorithms that are intentionally made more complex than what they need to do just to make them more opaque and to make money out of them better. So discrimination becomes invisible, and if you have this discrimination that is invisible, that is opaque, that is made by an opaque algorithm, then the mitigation, trying to reduce this discrimination becomes impossible. So let me tell you something about the sources of this algorithmic bias, some of the sources of this algorithmic bias, and there are many. So one thing is that data, in a sense, reflects society. So personal data is about people, and it reflects the way in which these people operate in society. So even if you choose not to use an attribute such as race, this attribute of race is reflected in other attributes that you will use in your data. So it has race has consequences, and maybe you are using those consequences. You're not using race, but you're using those consequences, so you're indirectly using these attributes that are encoded in other non-protected attributes. Of course, your data may not be correct, may not be complete, and you may have cases where usually the purpose of this non-discrimination is to protect a minority, and you may have cases where actually the decision boundary for the majority and for the minority very different. Maybe in this example they are even the opposite. So you have some classification, for instance, some classifier that works very well for a majority, but actually gives the completely wrong answer for the minority. So you have this problem of sampling when you create your classifier. And there are many assumptions that you probably may even teach at the beginning of your data mining courses or have been taught about these assumptions, and they are not always observed in reality. So there is this warning about how much of the theory can one apply in a certain situation where you have, for instance, variables that are not independent, or samples that are biased, or even labeled data that is incorrectly labeled and affects in your algorithm and makes it discriminate. The errors may be concentrated in a particular class, or maybe they may be different for different classes, as we see in the case of the COMPAS scores. And sometimes it's just that you're trying to create a model that is very simple, and the problem is more complicated than that. And this may also lead to discrimination. Now, some politicians are starting to notice this issue about data and algorithms and the role of data-driven policy and the roles of algorithmic decisions on people, and they are starting to get concerned about this. They have heard about some of these concerns. There is this recent report by the White House in May 2016 where they say, well, there are problems with data and algorithms. And this is a very interesting report because it's really condensed. It's very short, and it's designed for policymakers. Okay? It's designed to be understood by non-technical people. And they say, well, there are problems with the data. Maybe you are creating transportation policies for your city, and you're only taking into account trips by car. And you're not designing your transportation policies taking into account people who drive by bicycle. And if you do this, then your data is biased, and hence your policies are incorrect. Then you may also have data that is outdated, and you're using old data to make decisions. You have selected data with bias. So for instance, you have some data that comes from people who have smartphones, and you uncover a certain, for instance, mobility pattern in the city, but this mobility pattern is only valid for the people who are able to afford a smartphone, and it's not valid for the other people. So you have sample biases, and you may be perpetuating some biases. There are also problems with the algorithms. You may have matching systems that are not well designed, that, for instance, give one side of the matching an advantage over the other. You may have systems that do personalization in a way that narrows your options and it creates tunnel vision, filter bubble, all these buzzwords, but it's really about personalization services that are too narrow with respect to your options. There are decision-making systems that exploit a certain correlation in the data, assume this data is causation, even in a very subtle way. These things are sometimes not designed into the algorithms on purpose. They just happen. And then when you examine the algorithm, the assumptions, the design of these machine learning systems or this data mining system, you realize that there are certain hidden assumptions, such as this one, which is wrong. There are data sets that have to operate on disproportionate samples or very biased samples, and they are not correcting for that fact. And maybe again, the problem of complexity. You may have models that are too hard to understand or too hard to explain, and they may make mitigation harder. So let's speak about this from now the legal perspective. And here, as I go into more the legal side and then about the metrics, let me say that this is given that this is a young topic, you will see a lot of diversity here. So there is more than one definition, more than one legal definition of discrimination, and there is more than one metric of discrimination, and there is more than one problem definition, and there is more than one algorithm. Okay, these things are evolving, and hence you will see this thing branching out in several places during this part and the next part of the tutorial. Okay, so keep in mind that there is no kind of a straight path here. We're going to branch at several points. Now, anti-discrimination legislation is typically about seeking a balance in society. There is the hypothesis is that society needs some balance to operate, a series of balances to operate. When these balances are broken, society is broken, and you have more violence and misery and unhappiness, etc. So this anti-discrimination law is about these balances. But something really important about anti-discrimination law that I didn't realize until very recently is that anti-discrimination law is not only about preserving balance Anti-discrimination legislation and anti-discrimination efforts are about creating certain balances that do not exist in society. And this is confusing to some people. Like you look at your algorithm and your metrics and you say, well, I'm preserving the balance that exists. But actually, anti-discrimination measures are often about creating balances where a balance does not exist. There are many legal concepts. So one concept is, for instance, the concept of a genuine occupational requirement, right? So you have some reason to hire or not hire someone, or to give a credit or not give a credit that is really allowed by the law. So for instance, in the case of an occupational requirement that is genuine, you can say, well, you need a truck driver license to drive a truck. It's not that I'm discriminating because you look poor or whatever. It's because there is something obviously correct that I have to ask you in order for this job. Or another example is I'm in a theater. I have a play. I need a male character, and I want to hire a male actor, and this is okay. This is a genuine occupational requirement. There are these two concepts also about disparate impact and disparate treatment. There are things about burden of proof and situation testing I'm going to speak about, and the principle of group underrepresentation as a trigger for saying, hey, you're discriminating. So one fundamental concept in this anti-discrimination legislation is about treatment, the difference between treatment and impact. So disparate treatment basically means that you are treating people differently. It's a more obvious way of discrimination, right? So you can observe that people of a certain race, of a certain age, of a certain gender are being treated differently. The other is disparate impact, which is more subtle because it's about what's the outcome of the process. It's not you have not decided to treat people differently. You cannot show that but you can show in the consequences that there is a disparate outcome. So disparate treatment is clearly wrong, and it's so obviously wrong that it's codified as in legislation as a very obvious thing. You cannot, for instance, in Europe, people have decided that an insurer cannot make women pay premiums that are higher than men, even when the insurer can show that the costs are higher. It doesn't matter. The legislature or the regulator has decided, well, there is a balance I want to create here, and here is the balance, okay? And you follow that balance, and you figure out how you equalize things. And so this is about disparate treatment. Now, disparate impact is different. So this was solidified in US doctrine about 40 years ago, for almost 50, in a job. It was a trial about a job that didn't require skilled. It didn't require like a high school diploma. Didn't really require it for the nature of the job. It was a physical labor, but still the employer was asking for a high school diploma. And the court, I mean the prosecution proved in court that the employer was trying to discriminate against blacks. That this was the whole point of the high school diploma. It was not about requiring a high school diploma to shovel some coal. It was really because you needed because they wanted to exclude blacks from at that time from applying to this job. And disparate impact can be caused by a number of reasons, including some that we saw before. Now, proving discrimination is very difficult. Very rarely someone will confess or will be obvious that they discriminated someone. In some cases, the evidence is almost comically overwhelming. That there is this case in the UK about a job that was that requires fluency in Mandarin, and a lot of Chinese people applied, and a lot of people who were not of Chinese origin applied, and none of the people that were of Chinese origin were given even the chance to do an interview, which is ridiculous because the job was about required being fluent in Mandarin. So they actually got like a big fine for this. Now, in the EU Court of Justice, they divide the burden of proof, like what are the legal obligations for the defendant and the prosecutors, and they say, well, the accuser must show that there are some negative consequences, and the defendant, the company usually, the corporation, the organization, needs to prove that the process was fair, that they were not trying on purpose to harm other people. Let me speak about some measures of discrimination, some ways in which discrimination can be, let's say, measured and quantified. So there are some some principles and some ideas that tell you what's non-discriminatory, and as you go farther from this, then you can measure some discrimination. So, for instance, if you want to claim that an algorithm is fair, you should be able to show that people that are similar with respect to all the other attributes, not being a man or a woman, but about they have the same number of years of education, they have the same years of experience, and so on. They are equal in many other senses. They should be similar in terms of their outcome. They should have similar outcomes. And the differences should be explainable by these non-protected attributes. You cannot come and say, well, I didn't hire this person because he was Hispanic. You have to say something that is related to non-discriminatory, non-protected attributes. And there are two basic frameworks, and we're going to see this over and over during the presentation. There is things related to discrimination at the individual level, so you as a person were discriminated because of some reasons, and there are other things about discrimination at the group level. And this actually partitions the algorithms too. There are many algorithms that are about discrimination at the individual level. There are more algorithms actually that work about discrimination at the group level. And they look at this for this thing called as statistical parity. They look, things are the same. So at the individual level, you may look at something like, okay, what is the difference in the respect to the outcomes of two different people that are very close to each other? So if you take a person and you take the nearest neighbors to this person, then what is the difference between the original non-protected attributes? So are we speaking about people that have the same education, the same skills, the same experience, etc.? And then what's the difference in the outcome? So did these people that have so similar levels of education got access to credits with the same interest rate, or got access to were hired or not, and so on? So there is this difference. And I'm going to come back to this in one part. Now, a statistical parity of this idea of being fair to a group is more about proportions. And there are many, in the talk you will see there are many points where we use proportions, right? So you make this contingency table and you say, well, there is a group that is protected. For instance, you want to protect a minority, people of a certain ethnicity or whatever. And there is a group that is unprotected, which is all the rest of the people that you say, well, you're not being discriminated because there is an imbalance in society. And then there is a benefit that is denied or granted. Right, so you have people who don't get a job, people who don't get a credit, people who, for whatever reason, are discriminated, and that's important. So intuitively, and this is applied in many definitions, if, let's say, A over N1, which is the fraction of protected people that were not given a benefit, so for instance, the fraction of people with disabilities that didn't get a scholarship, if this fraction is much larger than the fraction of people without disabilities that actually that didn't get the scholarship, then you could claim that you are being discriminated because of the outcome, right? The impact of this policy or this algorithm or whatever over the people who have disabilities is higher than the impact of this policy over the people who did not have. This type of reasoning on the outcome has nothing to do with the process, right? It's about disparate impact, right? Okay. Let's speak of of course, you can, with this you can craft your own simple discrimination measures. The two more important ones are called risk difference and risk ratio. And they basically boil down to whether you want to express this difference in proportion as an arithmetic difference or you want to express it as a ratio. And there is nothing more complicated than that. So do you want to express this in terms of percentage points, like the fraction of black people who get a scholarship is 5 percentage points lower than the fraction of white people, or you want to express it as a ratio, and so on. This is a choice, and interestingly, UK law mentions this risk difference. Also the Equal Opportunity Commission in the US also speaks about these proportions. This risk difference as an arithmetic difference. The EU Court of Justice speaks about like the risk ratio, like the ratio between these two fractions, right? Now, in one case, you compare P1 against P2. P1 is the proportion in the protected group. P2 is the proportion in the unprotected group. In other cases, you compare P1 against the entire population, right? This is what they call like extended discrimination measures. They are basically about the fraction of black people who got the scholarship versus the fraction of all people who got the scholarship. It's not more complicated than that. Now, there are many other ways in which discrimination can be measured. You can take, for instance, if you take salaries, you can take, okay, let's compare the difference between the mean salary of one group and the mean salary of the other. You can create a regression model for one class and for the others. Again, for instance, salary, you can create one, you can take this same parametric model and learn it over the two data sets like blacks and whites or women and men, and then you go to the coefficients of this model and you notice that there are big differences in some coefficients that probably attributable to be using, to treating these groups differently. There are tests about ranking. There are things about, okay, to what extent the outcome leaks information about the protected attribute, even if you claim that you're not using the protected attribute, and we will speak a lot about that later, about unexplained differences, and there is this thing about consistency, like, are you really, for this person that has this attribute, if you look at all the people who are close to this person, do you really are making consistent decisions, or are you using some other information that you're not claiming that you're using? There is an example here in a paper of 2011 where they analyzed eBay pricing, and they noticed some positive in-group discrimination. So they created a regression model for the price using many different attributes, and one of those attributes was whether the race of the buyer and the seller were the same, and they noticed that for buyer and seller of the same race, there was certain coefficient that was clearly different, and they said, well, actually, in the consequences, you will see like actually you will get like a 7% discount on eBay if you just choose a seller that has your own race. Okay, and they show it using this idea of just looking at the coefficients in the regression. To kind of finish a bit about this part on the introduction, like if you think in terms of different contexts, you have many different scenarios where discrimination can occur. One is first jobs, employment, and here you can have lots of people who can discriminate at work, and the typical things that you want to detect is whether people are being paid the same to perform the same job when they have the same skills, the same experience, and so on, and they are very similar in all the non-protected attributes. And then you say, if there is a difference, then this, and I can trace back this difference to difference of race, then I can show that you are discriminating. Things about unemployment rate, things about people being segregated into different industries, and so on. And typically, this is a typical tool that you find in the literature for working in labor economics. People do these regressions of the salary on these attributes, and they look carefully at the coefficients and in order to make some claims about discrimination. Racial profiling is another thing. You have all this, let's say, media attention about the fact that people of certain ethnicity are being stopped more often by the police, and even you have, like in this case, it's a kind of funny campaign by the police. They will stop black drivers and offer them an ice cream and say, okay, you know, it's here, have an ice cream. And the fact that they choose to do this actually is actually, to me, it's horrible PR, because you're actually kind of exposing yourself and saying, well, it's true that we stop black drivers more than whites. Now, there are tools for this. One of these tools is situational testing, which is you try to do some experiments, or even you just observe, you do observational experiments. Now, in the credit market, this is a kind of a traditional area for discrimination studies. Many people work in this particular area, and they say, well, there are many instances of this thing they call redlining, where in the credit, the agency that is giving you the credit, the bank or whatever, they are deciding that in a certain district they are not going to offer a loan to anyone, right? And why they do this? Because in that district you have people of a certain ethnicity or of a certain origin, or you name it. And the typical tool that you can use to measure and to claim that these people are being discriminated is compare, for instance, the rejection rates for a mortgage or the rejection rate for a loan and so on across the different classes. Now, something very important with respect to anti-discrimination is that it's really related to privacy in more than one sense. There are many connections between discrimination, both in terms of both legal connections, and there are also technical connections, algorithmic connections between these topics. So, for instance, think of privacy and data protection. So, in Germany, there is this registry that is used is mandatory for people that are foreign, that are not national, that are not German nationals. You have to go and register in this thing, and this was challenged by some Austrian who said, look, I shouldn't have to be asked to fill in this registration because it's actually affecting negatively me. And the European Court in 2008 says, okay, there are certain things you can do with this registration and there are things you cannot do with this registration. It's okay if you want to check whether people are abusing their visa or overstaying their visa, that's fine. And it's okay if you want to do demographics with this registration, fine, but you cannot give to the statistics authority the names of the people. You just give them the counts and the proportions. And for criminal investigation, you cannot use this registration. Okay, so a German national, an Austrian national, whatever, they should be the same in terms of the criminal investigation. You cannot use this data for that purpose, right? So it's a kind of a balance. It's about seeking a balance. Okay, I want to keep this data, but I don't want this data to be used for secondary reasons that are not supposed to be the case. Now, the main difference is that privacy legislation cares about your personal data, like whatever you do with personal data, the privacy legislation tell you whether the personal data protection legislation tells you whether this is right or wrong, while in the case of discrimination legislation, it really has gone in the direction of we don't care about whether you did it on purpose or not. All that matters is what was the effect, what was the impact of this thing in different groups, independently of what was the mechanism that was done. And there is another connection that is very strong, and it will be exploited you will see how we can exploit it to claim discrimination and even to mitigate discrimination, which is the fact that if you want to find out whether people that have a certain attribute, for instance, females, blacks, gays, Hispanics, whatever, a minority, they were discriminated, is the same as trying to kind of reconstruct this attribute from a database in which you remove the column of gender, for instance. You add a column that has the outcome, whether this person was hired or not hired, or whether the salary was higher than a threshold or lower than a threshold, or even the salary itself. So you have this extra column with information, and you are asked to reconstruct gender or the race or whatever. You are asked to reconstruct that from the data that you're observing. If you're able to do it very easily, then you can claim that they are being discriminated because their salary is dependent on the gender. That's why you can reconstruct it so easily. If you cannot, then you need alternative ways of proving discrimination, and you can still continue trying to prove it. But this information leak gives you a very clear path to prove discrimination, and this a strong connection between privacy and discrimination. There are many, there are not so many, but there are a few resources that are emerging about this topic. There is the Fairness, Accountability, and Transparency in Machine Learning workshop. Now the third edition will be in November, if I'm not mistaken. There are keynotes, and there is even a book that has some author chapters and some contributed chapters that speaks about this topic. This is still kind of a new topic, kind of an open area, and this is very exciting for people interested in getting into this area. And there are these resources. You will find them in the web page of the tutorial. There are also small amount of tools. We have identified these two. One is DQ by the group in university, the data mining group in Pisa, that is about for analyzing a database, a relational database. And these are some screenshots, so you can do some queries. You can actually ask automatically the system to perform some of the discrimination analysis using some of their methods and others in an automated way, which is very cool. And there is also another tool, I'm going to speak about this like close to the end of this block, which is at Fisher, that allows you to analyze automatically, to reverse engineer an ad platform. And it allows you to create different identities and test whether these identities that differ in one attribute are being shown the same advertising or not, and to what extent this advertising depend on, for instance, on gender or race or salary or you name it.